Howdy folks, Nathan Adlen here with the Fast Lane Car, and I am in Crested, Butte, Colorado. Mazda brought us out here to drive vehicles in the snow and, just as importantly, have a glimpse at this, the 2016 Mazda CX-9. And coming up next, everything you wanted to know. Dave, tell us, what are we looking at here? This looks like an entirely different CX-9.
This is an entirely different CX-9. So our old previous CX-9 had a big 3.7 liter V6 in it, and now we have a remarkably small 2.5 liter turbo that makes much more torque and is faster than the 3.7 liter V6 and has dramatically better fuel economy.
Now this is still a Skyactiv engine, so it is high compression. Is it changed from the naturally aspirated engine versus this one?
Yeah, so this is based on the same engine family that the Skyactiv engine family that's in the rest of our cars, but the turbocharged, of course, we had to go through the whole engine and redesign it to handle the really high torque output that we're going to make. So our naturally aspirated engines are 13-to-1 compression. You always have to lower the compression ratio on a turbo engine, yes, because we're pumping so much more pressure and heat into the combustion chamber. But we managed to maintain a 10.5-to-1 compression, which is still very high for a turbo engine. And because we tuned this engine for really strong low RPM response and really high torque. We've got 310 foot-pounds of torque, and it pulls right off idle as if it's naturally aspirated. That puts a lot of cylinder pressure in there. So getting 10.5-to-1 compression in that condition was a real challenge. But it really pays off in drivability and really amazing fuel economy.
Now there's been a little bit of confusion. A lot of people, including myself, thought that this was a 2017 model, but it is actually being sold in the spring of 2016, so we'll all get a chance to drive it. Unfortunately, this one is a one-off prototype. We're not allowed to drive it today. Fortunately, we got tons of technical information just for you.
Well, you know, it's funny because you expect the big V6 engine is going to be the torquey, direct responsive one, right? And we put so much work into that torqueful, direct responsive feeling on this engine that this is actually much more direct and much more torqueful than the old V6 was. You know, people tend to shop on horsepower, thinking that's what's important, and in a sports car, it is. In a car like this, you're driving, you know, every day in the city. Low RPM response and directness and torque is really what pays off. And so we developed this engine specifically for this car, for that kind of driving. And so it has an enormous amount of torque right off the bottom. So every time you tip in, it just pulls directly. And that saves us a lot of downshifts and slipping torque converters and that kind of stuff. Our old V6 had a much more sort of high RPM biased power band. And so as you tip into it on the freeway, it would downshift once or twice to give you the acceleration you needed. Or sometimes there'd be a little bit of a sort of a slip or a backlash kind of feeling as you tip into the throttle and it would rev up a little bit as the torque converter slipped. This stays locked in a gear and just pulls directly. It's a whole different feeling, and it really makes the car feel light and nimble and direct. Yeah, so our design guys really stepped it up with this generation of the car. So it's not just an entirely new interior. Every single part of the vehicle is new. There's nothing carried over from the old car. But we really wanted to kind of push the envelope in terms of premium materials and premium feel in this car. You can see materials-wise, you can see this is this open pore rosewood that's it's made by actually a Japanese guitar maker. They were the only ones we could find who could do this compound curvature on a wood veneer. That's really hard to do, but we wanted that. You know, normally you have a wood that's like a single pane flat veneer stuck over some piece of plastic, and we wanted this more three-dimensional shape that makes it feel like it's just a solid chunk of wood. You know, it's a lot more authentic feel.
Now, it's been a while since I've had an opportunity to drive a turbocharged Mazda. The last time I drove a Speed 3 was about 4 years ago, and the CX-7, which, by the way, was one of my favorite crossovers because it had a turbocharger. And up here at high elevation, that is king. This baby, with its high compression, is still turbocharged, and most importantly, all-wheel drive with an all-new all-wheel drive system. Interesting.
Our whole philosophy at Mazda is around making the cars completely intuitive to drive. We've got a phrase called Jinba Itai, which is loosely translated, I'll get past all the horses and stuff. It's trying to make the car feel like it's an extension of your body. So you don't think about what's it going to do or how do I control it. It just is completely natural and intuitive, and that direct response is really part of that. The aluminum trim, speaking of authentic, is aluminum trim. It's not plastic with aluminum paint, you know, and the leather is a Napa leather, which our designers tell me is actually a thing. It's not like Corinthian leather. It's Napa leather. Yeah, that was completely make up. Napa leather is actually a different grade of leather that's thinner and more supple and lets them get the seat into a shape that they wanted more easily. Yeah, so this is our Mazda Connect system. This is shared across our line, but this is our infotainment system was really designed around being something that you could really use easily while you're driving. We benchmarked a lot of these infotainment systems, and we find a lot of them are really distracting to use while you're driving.
Right.
I feel like they were designed by somebody sitting at a desk who wasn't really thinking about how much you need to be looking out the windshield. And you know, one of the primary things we did is we made the main control is be a commander that's down here, out of your sight but completely in your reach, so you can reach it without having to kind of reach up. We don't want your body to move. Right. And what we found when we're looking at touch screens is when you reach up and touch a button on a touch screen, you have to watch your finger go up to it, or else you might miss and you'll bump the wrong thing. Sure. If you're going to a hard button, you don't have to look. You can kind of feel around, and once you feel you're there, you push the button, right? But you don't have that option on the touch screen. Once you touch it, it's selected. So you take so much more of your attention to make sure that you're touching the thing. Right. And so we put cameras on the dash facing the driver to watch what was happening as we were operating the different systems. And even watching myself, I think I'm pretty careful. Watching myself use a touch screen in the car was terrifying. So that got us to use a very simple commander with very few buttons and make a very simple layout that gets you from place to place. But the nice thing about this is I can reach down and feel it. I didn't have to look at it. Right. And you know, if I glance at the screen and know I need to move 2 clicks over and then select the thing, I can just go click, click, and those clicks correspond to those clicks, and so I have a tactile feedback, right? And so it's just a much more intuitive system to use once you sort of figure out the layout on it.
Does that retract?
It does not retract, no. We work really hard to keep the dash low and slim, so we don't have this big bulky thing in front of you. Sure. And anytime we have to make a retracting system, you have to leave room for this in there. Right. And this really helps us slim things down if we just leave it up all the time. It's pretty common strategy these days for big engines to get replaced with smaller turbocharged engines in the name of fuel efficiency. It always pays off on the window sticker. It doesn't always pay off in the real world. That's the trick. The reason a smaller turbo engine is more efficient than a bigger naturally aspirated engine is most of the time you're not using the full capability of the engine. Right. And so a big engine, you've got all this friction, all these parts moving around, and you're wasting fuel moving all that stuff. So a smaller turbocharged engine has less to move when it's just cruising using a light load. Turbocharged engines tend to use more fuel when they're making a lot of power. So when you actually get on boost, they're quite thirsty. That comes down to trying to control the combustion temperatures and the exhaust temperatures so the engine doesn't damage itself. And the simplest way to do that is to simply throw more fuel than the engine can burn, and that actually makes a cooler combustion. It wastes fuel though, but it doesn't cost anything when you build it because you already have fuel injectors, you already have a fuel pump, you just program in a little bit more fuel and you protect your engine. To get the real world fuel economy that we wanted on this, so it's not just something on the label, we want you to really experience that same fuel economy when you drive the car. We put in this cooled EGR system. So EGR is exhaust gas recirculation. Right. So what we're doing is we're trying to figure out another way to cool down the combustion when you're really hard on the throttle. So instead of throwing in extra fuel, we take some exhaust and reroute it back into the intake. And the exhaust doesn't have any oxygen left in it because you burned it off. And that lack of oxygen helps slow down the combustion and lower the combustion temperature. But the problem is that exhaust is hot. So we run it through a cooler first and run it back in there, and that gets us really great knock resistance, lowers the combustion temperature, and means we don't have to throw that extra fuel in there. So it was a complicated thing we had to engineer there. It doesn't change the window sticker at all. The window sticker looks exactly like it would have without it, but in the real world when you own the car, the fuel economy is much better.
Still a 3-row SUV.
It's still a 3-row SUV. We put a lot of work into making sure that the second rows fold down easily enough for children to do it. Because we did a lot of sort of watching families load in and out at school. And if you can stay in the driver's seat and let your big brother let the little kids in the back, that's a lot easier. Or let themselves in, you know? So we really wanted to make sure it's easy for that. And in fact, one of the seats, you can have a child seat in there and you can still flip it forward with the child seat still attached and get access to the third row. And in fact, we can actually see it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This is the EGR cooler itself. The exhaust gas is pulled off of the exhaust over there. The EGR valve is buried down under here. It comes up underneath, but this is a air to water heat exchanger. So this is coolant from the radiator circulating through here, and the exhaust comes through and it gets cooled down to roughly the same temperature as the coolant, which is much better than pulling it straight out of the exhaust.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, that's cool.
What are the numbers? Horsepower, torque?
So, like I said, the engine was tuned for torque first. So we get 310 foot-pounds of torque. And then the peak power at high RPM varies depending on what kind of fuel you run. If you run 87 octane fuel, it'll run totally fine, no problem. It makes about 225 horsepower. If you want to put premium fuel in, if you can get 93, not everybody can get 93. Yeah. 93 will make 250 horsepower. 91 will make somewhere in the middle. It just adapts to whatever you put in it. The reality is, though, we think people are going to try that premium fuel thing one time, notice that they don't feel any difference, and they're going to go back to it, because the difference is only like above 4,500 RPM. And because the engine is so torquey, you don't spend any time above 4,500 RPM, so it just pulls at low RPM.
Right, you're feeling the power at the lower end, and then as it's spinning up, that's the horsepower spinning, but it doesn't really make much of a difference in terms of feeling and performance.
Well, it doesn't make a difference because you didn't need to use high RPM to get to the speed you wanted to get to. If we had an engine that didn't have so much torque, you'd be revving it all the time. But because the way that we designed the engine, you don't really need to worry about that. Go ahead and put the premium in and try it, and if you like it, go ahead and use it. But we kind of figure this is the best, most honest way to rate the engine, is let you know what it'll do on each one and let you make the decision yourself.
Now, this is a 6-speed automatic transmission like the former one?
It is. It is a 6-speed automatic. It's not the same one as we had formerly. So this is our SkyActiv transmission. And I was saying earlier about how you'd have a little bit of kind of torque converter slippage with the old transmission. The new ones have a big clutch in the torque converter, and it locks the torque converter solid when you're driving. It basically only slips the torque converter when you're pulling away from a stop. And that locked up feeling gives you that really direct throttle response. Just like if you're in a manual transmission and you step on the gas, it just accelerates. Whereas you have this sort of rubber band slippy feeling with most automatics. Right. You don't get that with this one. It's really direct driving all the time. That makes the car feel better. It's more fun to drive. It's also a lot more fuel efficient. This is a new, for the CX-9, this is a new all-wheel drive system. It's the same concept that we're using in the CX-3 and the CX-5. It's called our iActiv all-wheel drive. And it's a predictive on-demand all-wheel drive system. So what it's doing is it's using, there's a whole bunch of data in the car from all these computer-controlled systems, the wheel speed sensors from the ABS, the steering torque and steering angle sensors from the power steering system. And we feed all this into the all-wheel drive system so it can figure out what are the conditions that it's driving in. It can actually use the steering and use the wheel speed sensors to measure the amount of traction you have at any minute, at any moment. It actually measures it 200 times per second. And using that data, it can figure out when you're likely to have a little front tire slip, and before that happens, it redirects the torque to the rear wheels instead. Yeah, so what we have is we're always driving the front wheels, and we have the drive shaft coming off there also being driven, and there's a clutch between the drive shaft and the rear axle. And when we want to transfer torque to the rear, you just start tightening up that clutch. And that clutch is a really precise, we can control exactly how much torque gets transferred through there. And with the amount of data we've coming in and how quickly we're processing, we can get to where it will never slip a front tire. It just puts exactly as much torque as it needs to get to the rear and no more. Because again, we're trying to get the best fuel economy all the time. Right. And we've actually figured out on different surfaces, different torque splits give you better fuel economy. The all-wheel drive system driving in the snow gets better fuel economy than a two-wheel drive system does. Interesting. Because when you put too much torque to the front tires, they're slipping a little bit. And it burns fuel. That friction against the ground as it's slipping, it wastes a lot of fuel. And so if we can calm those front tires down by redirecting some torque to the rear, it's more efficient and you get better gas mileage.
Well, I hope you like this special inside look at the 2016 Mazda CX-9. I certainly learned a lot. For the Fastlane Car, this is Nathan Adlen. Don't forget to go to TFL4K.com for news, views, real-world reviews, and snowy videos.
As you can tell by the length of my shadow, sun is going down and I've had a hell of a day. Bentley flew me out here to drive this, the most luxurious, the most expensive SUV you can buy. And I took it off-road, I took it into the desert, I took a helicopter to get to the desert. You know what? Instead of telling you about it, why don't I show you? And that is coming up right now on the Fastlane Car. I mean, come on, this is as much fun as it gets, right?
Sure.
To take a car like this that, let's face it, I doubt anybody will take out here, right?
Oh, I doubt it,
To take
yeah.
a car like this and actually kind of drift it through these dunes is so much fun. Oh my God.